This is the first of two lectures on Emile Zola's novel, The Work. The original French title was L'Oeuvre. This text has sometimes been translated as the masterpiece, or the title, that is, or the his masterpiece. I prefer a more literal translation of the title in this case as The Work, because it emphasizes one of the major themes of the novel, which is the question of the work that the artist devotes him or herself to over a course of one's lifetime. Now, we could think of the work as the larger corpus of works that a writer or a painter or a poet, for instance, creates. But it can also mean quite literally work, the work that one does. And this is one of the questions that Emile Zola raises in this novel, is because he was himself a quite dedicated worker. He worked very hard as a writer to create a corpus of writings, a series of novels that he wrote. He was in this sense influenced by his predecessor, Balzac. He didn't want to write just one novel. He wanted to write many, many novels that were interrelated. And he was quite ambitious as a young man, and this ambition drove him to create a number of important novels, important works. And yet the work that he performed became increasingly for him a burden, and one that didn't seem to bring him a whole lot of pleasure. So he began wrestling with this question: why do artists, painters, for instance, why do they spend so much time devoting themselves to art instead of simply living? And we're going to see, this is one of the themes that he wrestles with in this narrative, the theme of how the art that one creates as an artist, again, whether one's a painter, a poet, a dancer, whatever it is, can literally consume one's life, like a kind of a vampire drinking one's blood. And so we're going to see that the characters in his novel go from being very enthusiastic, wanting to change the world with the art that they create, to being so obsessed with their work that they lose sight of what's perhaps even more important: their families, their lovers. They're just simply enjoying life itself. Now, the image that you see there on the right is an image of Paul Cezanne. This photograph was taken in Aix En Provence. This is in south of France. This is a statue, a monument, in effect, to Paul Cezanne, who is one of the greatest painters who ever lived, certainly one of the greatest French painters who ever lived, and who grew up in Aix En Provence with Emile Zola. So one of the really interesting aspects of this narrative is that Zola spent a lot of his professional life, particularly as a young man, associating with many of the greatest painters of the 19th centuries, the painters associated with what we call today Impressionism, and he knew them all. And he was a journalist who wrote and defended them at a time when many attacked the Impressionists, this new movement that had emerged. But he was an ardent defender, and so in addition to being a chronicler of French life itself at this time in the mid to late 19th century, he chronicled many aspects of daily life, the lives of, for instance, coal miners, prostitutes, every aspect of society. No aspect was too gritty or grimy to escape his observation. But he also spent a lot of time observing the life of painters, many who led lives of great poverty. And so he wrote about their daily struggles as well. But it's quite interesting to think that one of the greatest French writers of the 19th century was also best friends with one of the greatest French painters of the 19th century, and indeed of all time, perhaps, and that's Paul Cezanne. And so Paul Cezanne and Emile Zola grew up together in Aix En Provence. They were essentially best friends. They spent so much time in each other's company. And then as they grew into young men, they encouraged one another. Interestingly enough, at first it was Zola who was painting, doing drawings, and Cezanne was writing poetry, and then that switched, and both in their own ways became very obsessed with their work. In the case of Cezanne, he became an obsessive painter, a figure that became quite mysterious, enigmatic in his own lifetime, a legendary kind of figure. Many who claimed was had no talent at all, but he became like, for instance, what in terms if you think of Flaubert, what Flaubert does with the novel, becoming a kind of a monastical fanatic as a writer. So too does Cezanne. He became a monastical fanatic painter who was completely obsessed. Now, one of the things that we're going to see that's quite interesting is that early in the career of both Cezanne and Zola, they both encouraged one another, and Zola often encouraged Cezanne. It was with Zola's prompting that Cezanne came to Paris and began to work there as a painter when he was quite young, and studying in many of the studios there. But later, Zola became more skeptical of the talent of Cezanne, and he indeed grew somewhat skeptical about the value of Impressionistic painting itself. And so he went from being an ardent supporter of Cezanne and an ardent supporter of this new movement in the arts to somewhat of a skeptic. And so what's interesting is that this novel, as we're going to see, that Zola wrote about the life of an obscure painter named Claude Lantier, who's living in Paris, is it's a very depressing portrait of a painter who becomes, again, like Cezanne, obsessed with painting, and but his obsession leads to nowhere. He's in the way in which Zola describes this fictional character in his novel, this painter that's based on Cezanne. He describes him as someone who is a very dedicated hard worker, much like Zola himself, but who was essentially a failure. And Zola, one thing that is interesting is that Zola in his lifetime received great acclaim and was very well known, very popular as a writer, one of the most best known, most read writers in France, and he remains this way. This is so even today. But Cezanne did not achieve notoriety until, or fame or recognition as a painter until the very end of his life, and even then it was guarded. It really wasn't until after his death that his genius came to be recognized. And I think it's fair to say now that the star of Paul Cezanne has eclipsed that of Zola. Although it's hard to say in the case of the arts; they're both very important artists. One a novelist, the other a painter. But Cezanne certainly is an artist who is venerated the world over and who had a tremendous influence on what was to come after the Impressionist movement in the early 20th century, for instance, on movements like Cubism, but other movements in the arts as well. And he even had an influence on writers like Gertrude Stein and Ernest Hemingway, who would go spend his days, upon the prompting of Stein, studying the paintings of Cezanne and the Jeu de Paume in Paris in order to learn how to write. And so Cezanne, if his genius was not recognized in his lifetime, it did come to be recognized in time. So we're going to look at what Zola does with this theme, and how also Cezanne and other painters who knew Zola very well received this novel. And I'll tell you right here at the beginning that Cezanne, after he read Zola's novel, they never spoke again. There's a lot of debate about this. Some biographers have said that the break between them was exaggerated, but the facts are that they did never speak again, and it did cause a rift in their relationship. Now, Cezanne was known to have wept profusely at the death of Zola. And Zola was, as was not found out until the mid 20th century, he was actually murdered because he was an ardent supporter of a man named Alfred Dreyfus, who was falsely accused of treason, and was effectively, he was in the French military. It was effectively a matter of anti-Semitism. Zola, Proust, and others were ardent defenders of Dreyfus. They were called Dreyfusards. But it turned out later. I mean, Zola died of smoke asphyxiation, and much later, a man confessed to having stuffed or blocked up his chimney pipe in his house, I think with a rock. And then the next day he came back and took it away. In the meantime, Zola had died of the smoke inhalation. So in effect, Zola was effectively assassinated for his political stance. And Zola is indeed a very interesting writer from a political perspective as well, if we think about it in terms of the themes that he chooses. Now, Zola is on the cusp of what's called, of the movement in the arts of literary realism. We think of the great realists like Flaubert and Leo Tolstoy of the mid-19th century. Zola is more often associated with naturalism, which is a term that he himself coined. And one of the key differences between realism and naturalism, they're very similar often in technique. But naturalism is often a bit more graphic. It explores themes that are considered to be unsavory by the realists. It takes us into the dirty, gritty, grimy aspects of existence. So if we think of the early Joyce, Dubliners was a work very much influenced by Zola and naturalism. But it was also interesting in a political sense, because one of the defining features of naturalism was that Zola was willing to explore what themes related to what Marx called the third estate. These were not just novels about the bourgeoisie. It was Hegel that called the novel the bourgeois epic, but these were novels about the working class, and the canonical example of this is Germinal. So here, let's take a moment and look at Zola. And I just listed a few of his novels. Zola was, again, very, very prolific as a writer. You can see he lived here from 1840 to 1902. There's a painting of Zola that was painted by Cézanne in the early stages of Cézanne's career, because they spent a lot of time in each other's company. Cézanne painted many portraits of Zola, but this is one of the few early portraits of Zola that Cézanne painted that survived. Now, they were both they had a vision. As I said, they were obsessive in their desire to become novelists, to become artists. Zola a novelist and Cézanne a painter. But Zola laid out this vision very early on, which came to be known as Les Rougon Macquart series of 20 novels that he wrote that were all interrelated, much like the novels of Balzac in his Human Comedy. But Zola took a much more, let's say, a systematic scientific approach to his quest in trying to describe various members of the same family over this series of 20 novels. Now, as I said, his novels were notable for their themes that were often grimy and gritty and shocked the public. And so Zola, like other writers like Joyce, often was accused of offending the public sensibility with the graphic nature of his writing. And naturalism, by definition, is quite graphic. His novel, for instance, Thérèse Raquin, published in 1867, was a novel, and this came some 10 or 11 years after Flaubert's Madame Bovary, and it deals with similar themes of kind of a tawdry, squalid novel about adultery, which offended many. L'Assommoir, published in 1877, is a novel that deals with themes of poverty and alcoholism, and poverty was one of the themes of novel. Now, remember, this is the time where like figures like Ingalls is writing the conditions of the working class in England. Dickens in England is writing about the poverty of the working class, also the poor of the poor. So Zola is similarly exploring these novels about what it is to live in abject poverty. Nana is, for instance, a novel about a prostitute, and Germinal, published in 1885, is a novel about coal miners and living in very squalid conditions, and and they go on strike and so on. So it covers these themes that really the more conventional novels of realism had not yet explored. And so he did break a lot of new ground, and there was a kind of a political import to his work that made him quite an important figure. Now in France today, Nana is even that word is passed into common parlance for referring to women of easy virtue. Because Nana was again, Stephen Crane, similarly in the United States, is considered to be a naturalist, the author of Red Badge of Courage, and he wrote also a novel, Maggie, A Girl of the Streets, similarly a novel about prostitution. Obviously, he was influenced by Zola. So many people were influenced by Zola. The early novel, Confession of Claude, this was this was not a particularly strong novel, but it's an interesting novel because it's his first novel, and he discusses in this novel, it's a thinly veiled autobiographical work where he discusses the agonies that he goes through trying to pull himself out of poverty through his writing. And one of the differences between Zola and Cezanne is that Zola he came to Aix En Provence. He was born in Paris, but he came to Aix En Provence about in what we think of as middle school, and his father went there to build a bridge, but his father died, and so he ended up. His mother got entangled in lawsuits trying to get money from from a wrongful death suit, and then ended up not winning, and so he grew up in great poverty, particularly from the time that he was, say, about middle school age. And Cézanne, by contrast, his father was not particularly well educated, nor was his mother, but he had made a pretty good living as a businessman and a speculator, in effect. And so Cézanne did not really go through some of the financial struggles that Zola did. As a painter, Cézanne in his early life was supported by his father on an allowance. His father wanted him to be a banker and was somewhat disappointed that he became a painter, but he indulged him after a while. It took a long time because at first he blocked Cézanne's efforts to become a painter, but in time he came to accept it, and he gave Cézanne a modest stipend to live on, and then after he died, Cézanne inherited his father's money and was able to live comfortably. Now in the work, which is based on the life of Cézanne, Zola makes his main character, Claude Lantier, who is modeled after Cézanne. He makes him more impoverished than Cézanne actually was. And in effect, Claude, although he is modeled on Cézanne, is also, there are dimensions to he's finally a literary character in a novel, and there are aspects to his personality that are really more drawn from Zola than from Cézanne, and part of it is linked to this idea of struggling with abject poverty. Zola pulled himself out of a situation of poverty to become quite successful and affluent, based on because of the popularity of his novels. So although Cézanne didn't experience the poverty that Zola experienced, he also never experienced the acclaim that Zola gained as an artist. Now here's a portrait of Paul Cezanne, a painting that he painted of himself. Cezanne lived from 1939 to 1906. He lived a bit longer than Zola, but again, Zola was murdered effectively. So, and as I said previously, Cezanne was known to have been very emotionally distraught upon learning of the death of his childhood friend, Zola. Now here, as you can see on this map on the right, this is in the red, this is where Aix En Provence is in France. It's a very beautiful region. It's also along the coast. It includes many of the very wealthy parts of France as well, like places like it also has places like Marseille, and then if you drive further along the coast, it's Monaco. This is where, for instance, the Murphys and Scott Fitzgerald and Hemingway would go in the early 1920s as well. It's known. This area is known for its beauty, and Zola. So what happened essentially was that when Zola moved to Aix En Provence from Paris, and about this time it took about, today you can take a train from Paris to Aix En Provence and get there maybe 4 hours, but at this time it took much longer, 19, 20 hours or so, to get back and forth between Paris and Aix En Provence. But when Zola came there, he was not accepted in the school because he spoke with a Parisian accent, and he was a little bit more intelligent and sensitive than many of his peers, and so he would get beat up, and Cézanne, who was a year older than him, would come to his defense, and they went from that to being quite close, and became known as the Inseparables because they were always together. Now on the left, you see an image of a fountain on the streets of Aix En Provence. And you can certainly see today, if you go to Aix En Provence, you see marks of Cézanne everywhere, and you don't see quite as many references to Zola. But Cézanne, like I said, in his lifetime when he lived in Aix En Provence, people thought he was kind of mad and eccentric, and they didn't really accept the fact that he had talent. But of course, after his death, that changed very much, and now he's one of the main reasons why tourists come to Aix En Provence in France today, to walk the very streets where Cézanne walked, and you can see his atelier is there as well, where he painted. It's now become a museum. So there's a nice art museum in Aix En Provence as well that houses some of the paintings of Cézanne. Many more at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. Here, now Aix En Provence, when you go out of the city, now it's a lot more urban. And in the day when Cézanne lived, it was, you just would go from the city out into the country. It's very beautiful. And this is Mount Saint Victoire. On the right is a photograph. On the left is a painting that Cézanne made of this. And he became very obsessive about painting this mountain. So some of his paintings of Mount Saint Victoire are some of his more popular paintings, some of his better known paintings. And many have come in the years since his death to have paid homage to taking trips to Aix En Provence and Mount Saint Victoire to see the mountain where Cézanne painted, and the hills where he walked, and the trees where he painted among, including figures like Martin Heidegger, who Heidegger became very obsessed, particularly in his later years, with the painting of Cézanne, and saw in Cézanne a kindred spirit. And so he took Heidegger would come from Germany to Aix En Provence, and he came, as many others have, just simply to see to be in the same place where Cézanne was, and to compare Cézanne's paintings with what Aix En Provence actually looked like. Now, here's a description. In the early pages of this novel, Zola describes their boyhood of these two characters. Now, Claude Lantier is the character who's based on Cézanne. Pierre Sandoz is the character who's based on Emile Zola. And they had a very idyllic boyhood. So, and what's interesting, one of the things that, from a perspective of writing, that's interesting about these descriptions is that most of Zola, Zola took a very scientific approach to novel writing. And so he would go out, like if he wanted to write about, let's say, coal miners, as he did in the Germinal, he would go out and he would very systematically study the life of coal miners and in a very scientific way develop knowledge of them before he wrote his novels about their lives. Much like, for instance, say, John Steinbeck, who traveled with Okies before he wrote uh, Grapes of Wrath. And but in the case of this novel, it differs from the other novels in Zola's corpus of writing, because that he draws in the work, or Louvre, he draws from his own experiences, his own memories. And in the early pages of the novel, we get these very idealistic images of his boyhood along with Cézanne in Aix En Provence, when they were known as the Inseparables, along with another young man who later, called here Louis Dubuche, who later became an engineer and fell out. He wasn't, as they grew up, he was not an artist, and so they gradually drifted apart. But whereas Zola and Cézanne maintained their relationship throughout their life, very close relationship, again, until Zola wrote this novel, which then led to a rupture between between them. But here's a description of this idyllic boyhood in Aix En Provence. At the College of Plassans, while still in the lowest form, Claude Lantier, Pierre Sandoz, and another lad named Louis Dubuche had been three inseparables. And this term, they were known as the Inseparables, Cézanne and Zola, as their relationship continued in Paris. Sprung from three different classes of society, by no means similar in character, but simply born in the same year at a few months' intervals, they had become friends at once and for life. Impelled thereto by certain affinities, the still vague promptings of a common ambition, the dawning consciousness of possessing greater intelligence than the set of dunces who mistreated them. So this was and Zola, these are descriptions that really come straight out of, also, if you read the letters of Cézanne and Zola that they exchanged between one another, that they were like, they had these affinities. They were sensitive and artistic in their outlook, and they were surrounded by ruffians, and so it was partly on this basis that they grew so close together. And they often spoke, Zola as well as Cézanne spoke of these glorious days of doing swimming nude in the waters out in the country, and just living in nature. And the nature of Aix En Provence will become really one of the major themes of Cézanne's work, whereas Zola is going to live most of his adult life in Paris, Cézanne will go back and forth between Paris and Aix En Provence, but he spent a good part of his adult life as a painter living in Aix, and in fact spent far more time in Aix. He got to where he didn't even really like being in Paris, as he became increasingly eccentric, increasingly reclusive, and would just be known to wander the landscapes of Aix En Provence. But as children, they had quite a wonderful time in this growing friendship, reading poetry together and fishing and so on. Here's again Zola. They relapsed again into reminiscence. This is the older Claude and Sandoz, who are thinking about their wonderful childhood when they're in Paris. But such as made their hearts thump, the remembrance of the many happy days they had spent far away from the college, in the open air and the full sunlight. When still very young and only in the sixth form, this is about middle school, the three inseparables had become passionately fond of taking long walks. The shortest holidays were eagerly seized upon to tramp for miles and miles, and getting bolder as they grew up, they finished by scouring the whole of the countryside, by making journeys that sometimes lasted for days. They slept where they could, in the cleft of a rock, on some threshing floor still burning hot, where the straw of the beaten corn made them a soft couch, or in some deserted hut, the ground of which they covered with wild thyme and lavender. Those were flights far from the everyday world, when they became absorbed in healthy Mother Nature herself, adorning trees and streams and mountains, reveling in the supreme joy of being alone and free. But Claude and Sandoz never wearied. They awakened each other every Sunday morning by throwing stones at their respective shutters. In summer, above all, they were haunted by the thought of the Viron, the torrent whose tiny stream waters the low-lying pastures of Plassans. When scarcely 12, they already knew how to swim, and it became a passion with them to potter about in the holes where the water accumulated, to spend whole days there, stark naked, drying themselves on the burning sand, and then plunging again into the river, living there, as it were, on their backs, on their stomachs, searching among the reeds on the banks, immersed up to their ears, and watching the hiding places of the eels for hours at a stretch. That constant contact of water beneath a burning sun prolonged their childhood, as it were, and lent them the joyous laughter of truant urchins, though they were almost young men, when of an evening they returned to the town amidst the still oppressive heat of a summer sunset. Their eyes moistened at the recollection of those happy days. They once more beheld the white, endless roads covered with layers of dust, as if there had been a fall of snow. And so even after they fell out, they were known to say very kind things to one another, and they never really gave up these wonderful memories when they had been like brothers out there, and had essentially grown up together. So they were quite close, and it's very interesting. Some have speculated that perhaps one of the reasons why Zola did not understand or appreciate the genius of Cezanne was that just the probability of two great artists growing up, being knowing each other like this, and then each having authentic talent. As Zola's talent was recognized, Cezanne's was not. It just seemed too improbable. But in fact, this was the case. It's a very interesting instance of two children growing up together who both become great artists in their own right and in their own way, but in different fields. Now here's on the left, you see an image of Cézanne, and on the right, you see an image of Zola. This is when they were young, and when they were living in Paris. This is one of the few photographs of Cézanne as a young man. Zola became, as a naturalist, he became very interested in photography himself, and it became one of his hobbies, in effect. He took quite a few amateur photographs that you can access if you Google them and look at them on the internet. Now, in this novel, Zola himself describes what his vision is, and this is very again, Sandoz is modeled after Zola, Claude is modeled after Cézanne, and he's very this is very an autobiographical moment in the novel where he's talking about what it was his dream as a child, and it was with Cézanne that he shared this dream as he laid out this, as he envisioned this plan that would become essentially his life plan as a writer. And he stayed very faithful to this plan that he developed. Because one day while Sandoz was alone with Claude on an island of the Seine, this is when they were older in Paris, both of them lying there with their eyes fixed on the sky, he told the painter of his vast ambition, confessed himself out loud. Journalism, let me tell you, is only a battlefield. A man must live, and he has to fight to do so. Then again, that wanton, the press, despite the unpleasant phrases of the profession, is after all a tremendous power, a resistless weapon in the hands of a fellow with the convictions. But it says, but I want to note here. So, and this is what happened in Zola's own life as well. So he got, like Hemingway, for instance, he got his start in journalism, but it was for him a means to an end. He didn't want to stay a journalist. He wanted to free himself from journalism, but he used it to, for instance, to promote the Impressionists at a time when nobody else had faith in them. So he thought of it as a powerful weapon, but he didn't. He was not. His vision was not finally to become a journalist, but to become a novelist. He says, but if I am obliged to avail myself of journalism, I don't mean to grow gray in it. Oh dear, no. And besides, I found what I wanted, a machine that'll crush one with work. Now he's speaking here with enthusiasm, but later we're going to see this is his when he finally becomes crushed under that load of work, his attitude changes a bit. Something I'm going to plunge into, perhaps never come out of it, and he doesn't. To study man as he is, not man the metaphysical puppet, but physiological man whose nature is determined by his surroundings, and to show all his organism in full play. That's my idea. This is, again, the skepticism about what he's calling the metaphysical puppet is what is similar to the kind of the increasing disenchantment with realism as being linked to the metaphysics of let's say realism with the capital R, the metaphysical realism, say, of figure like Aquinas. The increasing skepticism about that and the movement towards a more, again, scientific conception of what it is that writers, novelists should be doing, or sociological is another way to think of that. That's my idea. Is it not farcical that some should constantly and exclusively study the functions of the brain on the pretext that the brain alone is the noble part of our organism? Thought, confound it all. Thought is the product of the whole body. Let them try to make a brain think by itself alone. And again, he's like he's not interested in just rational man or rational woman, but because we're more than just rational beings, we're also beings who are in the world. And he wants to explore humanity and all its complexity, human life and all its complexity. See what becomes of the nobleness of the brain when the stomach is ailing. No, it's idiotic. There is no philosophy nor science in it. We are positivists, evolutionists, and yet we are to stick to the literary lay figures of classic times and continue disentangling the tangled locks of pure reason. He who says psychologist says traitor to truth. Besides, psychology, physiology, it all signifies nothing. The one has become blended with the other, and both are but one nowadays. The mechanism of man leading to the sum total of his functions. The formula is there. Our modern revolution has no other basis. It means the certain death of old society, the birth of a new one, and necessarily the upspringing of a new art in a new soil. So you see, he has a very grandiose vision, a conception of himself and the changing of the times and wanting to be on the cusp of what's happening in his society. Yes, people will see what literature will sprout forth for the coming century of science and democracy. I am going to take a family and I shall study its members one by one, whence they come, whither they go, how they react upon one another. In short, I shall have mankind in a small compass, the way in which mankind grows and behaves. On the other hand, I shall set my men and women in some given period of history, which will provide me with the necessary surroundings and circumstances. You understand? A series of books, 15, 20 books, episodes that will cling together, although each will have a separate framework, a series of novels with which I shall be able to build myself a house for my old days, if they don't crush me. Now, this is precisely what Zola does. And the series of novels that he developed included 20 books, all interrelated. It was a grandiose project. It was in effect, it's 20 novels that are one novel and that are interrelated to give a very complex image of society at his time. And he builds himself a very nice house. Cézanne, before they're falling out, comes to visit him quite often and paints Zola's wife and goes wandering in the hills and attends the dinner parties that Zola throws. But Zola does come to feel increasingly crushed under this load. And I think it's important to remember that although this is a novel about a painter, the burden that we see, Claude Lantier, the painter, struggling with is really, in some ways, Zola is also writing about himself. Now, here is a painting of Zola painted by the painter Monet, Edward Monet, who lived from 1832 to 1833. This is a photograph of Monet on the right, and Monet was a close friend of Zola's, and Zola was a champion of Monet among other of the early Impressionists. And so you can see what Zola looked like in the eyes of Monet, But I'd like you to look at this image for a moment, because in many ways, the Monet, the portrait, the Monet portrait of Zola that we see here is, in the visual arts, a fairly good parallel, or an accurate, it offers us an accurate image of the aesthetic sensibility of Zola himself. And so perhaps it's Monet as a painter who is closest in sensibility to Zola. And so this is, again, naturalism, one could think of it as a form of realism, a more extreme form of realism. And this is indeed a realistic image, but it takes realism to another level, and it's more naturalistic in effect, at least this particular portrait. And so Zola himself this is his description of Monet. He describes him as a realist, a positivist, a naturalist, an analyst. And in this case, he could also be describing himself, because this is what he saw himself as well. Now here's another painting by Monet of a woman at the I believe this is the Folies Bergère, the Moulin Rouge, who's a server. And if you look at the detail, the realism of the portrait, this is, again, very similar in aesthetic sensibility to the prose of Zola. Now I want to also show you, now here, this is another painting by Monet. This was one of the most shocking paintings that he painted. You can see this today in the Musée d'Orsay. It was, for a long time, it hung in the Jeu de Paume before they closed the Jeu de Paume and moved all of those paintings over to the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. But this painting was greatly upsetting to many who viewed it. John Berger wrote a little book called Ways of Seeing, which features this painting, and how, in Berger's reading of it anyway, it completely destroyed the convention of the nude because of a couple of things. One, the naturalism of his depiction of this woman. I'll show you here. Here's a more conventional nude. You can see it's much more idealized. But I would also have you note the face of the woman, who is demure and not looking at the looker who's looking at her. Whereas if we go back, if we go back to this is this painting called Olympia, you can see that she is looking directly back at the viewer, and this just looks like, this is not idealized. This just looks like a woman without her clothes on, and this was shocking when people first saw it, and it completely, at least in John Berger's reading, and I think he's right, it completely revolutionized the tradition of the nude, and in many ways made the nude no longer tenable, because we can see here that this is a woman who's simply an aesthetic object for appreciation. Whereas if we go back to this woman, we can see her looking back at the person looking at her. It implies a certain agency that is lacking in the image of this woman. And so in the same way, Zola, seeks to give us a much more naturalistic, also we could call it realistic, depiction of who people really are, moving away from the more, what he called, a metaphysical or idealized images of humanity that preceded the literature and the painting that came before him. Now, here's some figures of these are all figures who he called naturalists. Now, I would note here that Zola coined this term naturalist, and he used it to describe these painters, but also himself as a writer, and the term stuck for the kind of writing that he was doing. But later, it didn't stick for the painting. These painters came to be known as impressionists. But before the term impressionism solidified and became very widely used, of wider currency, the term that Zola adapted and used in some of the journalism that he wrote for these painters was naturalist. So he considered these all naturalists like himself. So in addition to Edward Manet, Camille Pissarro, who lived from 1830 to 1903, he later would become a very close friend of Cézanne. The two of them would spend many, many hours in each other's company, and they learned from one another as painters. And Cézanne considered Pissarro to be, one time Cézanne said something to the fact of, well, maybe we all come from Pissarro. He held Pissarro in awe. Today, Cezanne is better known than Pissarro, but they're both very important painters that Zola called naturalists, but today I think we would think of them more as impressionists. Now, Auguste Renoir, he lived from 1841 to 1915. This is in each case you see their self-portraits. These are the paintings that each man painted of himself. And then Claude Monet, who lived from 1840 to 1926, not to be confused with Edward Manet, although their names are similar. They're two very different painters. They're both impressionists. Now, in the case of Monet, he would be also a figure who will become a character who become modeled after the character Elster, also known as Biche in Marcel Proust's À la recherche de temps perdu, or In Search of Lost Time. He becomes an important character, and Monet was a friend of the Proust family. Here is a painting of Pissarro, and so you can see again its aesthetic sensibility. This is a painting that I think we could consider to be more leaning towards this kind of naturalism that Zola is affirming. Here's a Renoir painting, very famous painting by Renoir that also Zola considered to be naturalist. And then here is not a Manet but a Monet painting that also fell under this rubric, or at least in the eyes of Zola. And they spent so much time in each other's company. Zola would go to each of their studios. They would eat in the same cafes and spend time in the evenings together. Cézanne sometimes would, but Cézanne was he had a much more difficult personality. I think today we consider maybe a little bit, I don't know if bipolar is the word, but he certainly was very moody. And Cézanne hated theories of art. And so when people started talking about art, he'd usually get up and leave. His idea was just, he did talk about art, and there were some speculative ideas that he put out, but he didn't like obsessive theorizing, and he was difficult to get along with. But Zola got along with him quite well, and Zola always said, look, you can't judge Cézanne. You have to judge him by his heart. He's irritable and difficult, but he has a very good heart. Now here is a Monet painting that Monet himself called Impression, Soleil Levant, or the sun, setting, and it's this painting, or excuse me, it's not sun setting, it's the sun rising. It was Louis Leroy, who lived from 1815 to 1885, who coined this term in April 25, 1874, when he wrote an article about this painting that Monet himself had called Impression. And he coined this term Impressionism, and this became the term that today became very popular, and it eclipsed the term naturalism that Zola was promoting in his journalism. So today these painters are often much more thought of as impressionists rather than naturalists. But I think in some ways the term impression is indeed more accurate, because it emphasizes one of the things that was really important to these painters, and that is the sensory stimulus. And we can think of this even in a kind of a British empiricist sense, like what British empiricists like Hartley would call the trace, the idea of a stimulus. And so this is a very empirical, external way of thinking about our experiences. It doesn't start, in this case, with something that is intuitive and internal, but it's external, it's outside, it's a stimulus, and the impressionist is interested in capturing the stimulus. And here is how Zola in the European Herald in 1879 is going to describe it when he uses this term. Now, what this was his journalism was so, it seems kind of difficult to believe today, but at this time, defending these painters who were so reviled in popular society was so controversial that he couldn't even publish this journalism in France. So he published this in a Russian in the Russian paper called the European Herald. So he did write about it, but it didn't get published in Paris. It got published in Russia. And here's how he described it. He says, the Impressionists have introduced open air painting. This term's going to become very important, like getting out of the studio, going into the open air. And this is a big theme in the novel, this idea of being in the open air. The study of shifting effects of nature depending on the innumerable variations of weather and the time of day. Again, this is Impressionism. They consider Courbet's technique, he was more of a realist, superb as it is, leads only to magnificent studio paintings. They themselves take the analysis of nature further, breaking light down into its constituent parts, studying the effects of air movement, the shading of color, the random variations of light and shadow, all the optical phenomenon which make a vista so changing and difficult to render. So again, let me read this again. The shifting effects on nature depending on the innumerable variations of weather and the time of day. Now you can see this very clearly in the series of paintings that Monet painted of the cathedral at Rouen, which is again the same cathedral that Flaubert, in the town where Flaubert lived and based his story of Saint Julian and the Three Tales was based on stained glass in this cathedral. But Monet would go to the cathedral every day and he would paint it. Each time he painted it, it would be a slightly different painting that he was looking at. And I think this, if we go back and look at at Zola's description of Impressionism, and then you look at what Monet's doing in his paintings of this cathedral, it gives us a pretty good sense of what Impressionism is. But I would note that Cézanne was not impressed with this. He didn't, and this is what made, and part of what made Cézanne different, although he wasn't really understood at the time, was that, he too started with the impression, but he believed that the impression needed to be, structured or intellectually organized as a process that takes place within the mind. And this was too, for him, we could say that for Cézanne, this would be too impressionistic, and it wouldn't take into enough account the way in which, in perceiving objects, we also create them, that there's a process of creation at work in the perception of the object. And this is one of the differences between, say, a painter like Monet and a painter like Cézanne. But this difference was what was not really understood or appreciated in the time that Cézanne was writing, and it certainly was not understood by Zola, who simply thought that although he was a hard worker, that Cézanne was a failure. Now here's what Cézanne will say. He says, there are two things in the painter, the eye and the brain. The two must cooperate. One must work for the development of both. But as a painter, of the eye through the outlook of nature, of the brain through the logic of organized sensations that provide the means of expression, my goal is to become classical again through nature. That is to say, through sensation. So this is really a key quote. If you read this and you reflect upon it, you think about it, you'll understand a great deal about what is going on in the paintings of Cézanne and why he was such an innovator in the time. Why he completely will change the painting of the 20th century. Which will lead to innovations like the development, say, of Cubism. But we could say that for Cézanne, that the Monet paintings of the cathedral at Rouen were too much influenced by the eye, not enough of the brain. And so he didn't reject the eye. Again, one starts with the sensation, but the sensation becomes organized and it becomes structured. It becomes classical again through nature. So this also is perhaps one of the reasons why Heidegger was so interested in Cézanne, is that he saw in Cézanne's painting what Zola was not able to see, this more classical, even in Hellenic sensibility in the paintings of Cézanne. Now here you can see an example of what we're talking about. Again, this is Mount Saint Victoire, and you can see it is nature, but it's nature. He sees with the eye, he begins with the impression, but it is nature, very much a structured image of nature. And it has a kind of a classical, almost a geometrical dimension to it in the way that Cezanne puts together the corresponding elements that form his composition. Now here, this is this is a painting by Picasso, and if we go back and look, we can see, that say, although Cezanne is not really a cubist, you can see how he would be considered to be the father of Cubism. Cezanne, or Picasso, excuse me, was obsessed with Cezanne, as was Braque. There would be no uh, Cezanne, excuse me, there would be no Cubism without Cezanne. So he's a forerunner to many of the movements of Cubism besides Cubism, many developments in painting in the 20th century. And so there's good reason why Picasso was so devoted to Cezanne and saw him as an important teacher. And Picasso, very rarely, there were very few painters whom he acknowledged as influences upon him, as was the case with Cezanne. Now here you can see, on the left is a Cubist painting by Picasso. On the right is Juan Gris's portrait of Picasso. Juan Gris and Picasso both were the figures that were associated with Cubism in its early development. They also were closely associated with themselves, also with Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein, as a writer, is going to be very influenced by Cezanne, and became good friends with both Gris and Picasso. And Gertrude Stein was one of the first persons who, in her salon at the Rue 27, Rue de Flores in Paris, who appreciated Cezanne. And she began buying Cezanne paintings at a time when nobody thought that he had much talent. And this was one of the things that drew Picasso to her. And then also one of the reasons why Cezanne became much better known, because of the many people who would come into the salon of Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas in Paris and see these Cezannes hanging in her room, in her salon. Now here, on the far left, this is a painting of a self-portrait of Cezanne. On right next to it is a Cezanne painting of the art dealer Ambroise Voillard, who Cezanne painted. Pablo Picasso, right next to the painting by Cezanne of Voillard, you see Picasso's painting of the same art dealer, and then on the far right, you see a painting by Juan Gris, a Cubist painting. So you can see, if you look at Cezanne's painting of this art dealer, these two artists, Picasso and Cezanne, are painting the same art dealer, and you can see how, while the Picasso painting takes it to a much more radical extreme, and then so too with Juan Gris takes it even further, you can nonetheless see the highly organized, structured nature of the image painted, or the portrait painted by Cezanne, which would become so influential for Picasso and the development of Cubism. So Cezanne was a great painter indeed, but Zola, for whatever reason, was simply unable to recognize the genius of his very close childhood friend. Now, again, as I said, it wasn't only Cezanne. Zola, although Zola did think of Cezanne as a failure as a painter, he went from being very enthusiastic in his mid-20s to much more disenchanted with the entire group of Impressionists. He thought that they didn't rise to the level of success that he had expected them to do, and he thought that that his own success as a writer was evidence of his that he was on the right track, and the fact that they themselves had not found the acclaim that he had found was, for him, evidence in itself that there was something amiss in their in what they were about. So here's how he states it. He says, "The real misfortune is that no artist of this group has achieved powerfully and definitively the new formula that, scattered through their works, they all offer. The formula is there, endlessly diffused, but in no place among any of them is it to be found applied by a master. They are all forerunners. The man of genius has not arisen." This is astounding, that he's unable to to see this, but he simply couldn't see it. He says we can see that what they intend and find them right, but we seek in vain the masterpiece, that is to lay down the formula and make heads bow before it. This is why the battle of the Impressionists has not yet ended. They remain inferior to what they undertake. They stammer without being able to find the word. Now, this is why many of the Impressionists who were good friends with Zola are somewhat flummoxed at this criticism of them, and they also all grasp that implied and implicit in this is that he is the one who has found the word, whereas they haven't. So he sees that they've not, they're on the right track, but there's no true genius among the lot. I think this view would be universally rejected today. This shows us a pretty profound shortcoming in Zola's understanding of art. He was a novelist, but did he really understand painting? This is one criticism that one could raise about this novel. Now here's Zola in 1896 writing, and this is not again from the novel. This is from his journalism. And he's much older now. He's 56. He says, 30 years have passed since my intoxication with these painters when I was 26, and I have somewhat lost interest in painting. I had grown up virtually in the same cradle as Paul Cezanne. One is only now beginning to discover some touches of genius in this abortive great painter. Well, that's a pretty condescending description. Also, he just calls him basically an abortion. Let us assume that I slept for 30 years. Yesterday, I was still pounding with Cézanne the hard pavement of Paris and the fever of conquering it. Yesterday, I went to the Salon of 1865 with Monet, and Pissarro, whose paintings had been summarily rejected. I awaken and shudder. What? Was it really for this that I fought? For this bright painting, these spots, these reflections, this decomposition of light? Lord, was I mad? But it is very ugly. I find it repulsive. And so we see a real change in his sensibility. He goes from being very enthusiastic to very critical, and indeed we see the same kind of negativity, skepticism that appears in his depiction of the life task of Claude Lantier, the painter whom he describes in this novel, who becomes his figure based again loosely on Cézanne. No, I did not. I did my duty. I fought the good fight. I was 26. I was with the young and the brave. That which I defended, I would defend again, for it was the daring of the moment, the flag that had to be planted on enemy territory. We were right only because we represented enthusiasm and faith. The truth we established, however small, is accepted today. And so he thinks that their accomplishments are very modest indeed, perhaps in comparison with his own, which he thought of as quite substantial. This is astounding when you look at, I'm just going to show you here a couple of images. This is some still lifes by Cézanne, the kinds of paintings that would enrapture figures like Heidegger, who see in this manifestations of or ways of reclaiming being itself in the representation of the real. So you can see, if you look at the way, like on the right, if you look at the way that Cézanne works with light, this was a constant source of wonder to fellow painters. I mean, Cézanne became known as sort of the painter's painter, that the public didn't understand what he was about, but the painters did, and they were just in awe and admiration of him. But this what he accomplished, Zola simply could not see. There you see on the right, there's a painting that he did of his father. On the left, this famous painting that he did of two men playing cards. Here's one of his landscapes. Again, there are many similar landscapes and acts like this that he painted that revealed this compositional integrity, as well as play so brilliantly and beautifully with light. And when you're looking at the Cézanne paintings, what he does with the light, with the white, is very significant, and it's something to attend to. Now, we could think of Zola's The Work or Louvre as what we call a roman à clé, which is a key, a novel with a key to it. And so this is a kind of a novel that is that if you have the key, you can figure out who it's based upon. So this is a genre known as roman à clé, or the novel with a kind of a secret or hidden key to figure it out. So we think of Claude Lantier. He's the main character, the rather obsessive, irritable figure who's much like Cezanne. When the novel first appeared, however, the public didn't really immediately associate this figure with Cezanne. This was simply because Cezanne was not as well known as, say, Monet and Manet at this time, who had achieved at that point some acclaim, whereas Cezanne was still laboring in obscurity. But let's note that his name is Claude, like Claude Monet, and so he bears some resemblances also to although the main figure, the main model is Cezanne himself, he does bear some resemblances to Monet and also to Manet, as we're going to see the episode where Claude Lantier takes his great work to the Salon des Refusés, or the Salon of the Rejected Painters, where he shows his work. The work that is shown is really based more on a painting that Monet painted that I'll show you in just a minute. That really and the controversy surrounding the displaying of this painting really is very similar to the controversy that occurred when Monet displayed his famous painting, which I'll show you, and then Zola himself, as I said previously, who was put a lot of himself in this image of this failed painter as well. Particularly, this is a painter who is a failure, but who, like Zola, was very obsessive in his approach to his craft and his work. And then Christine Lantier, who's based on Hortense Cézanne, the wife of Cézanne, who Cézanne painted, made quite a few portraits of as well. You can see one. This is an image from Cézanne that hangs in the museum in Aix En Provence of his wife Hortense, but he painted many other paintings of her as well that are quite well known. And then Pierre Sandoz, who's based on Zola, Henriette Sandoz, who's based on Zola's wife, Alexandrine Zola, who also was a model who sat for Cézanne as well. This has led some to speculate that Cézanne and the wife of Zola, before she became his wife, was the lover of Cézanne. And there was a kind of a menage a trois. I don't know how much truth there is to this. There was a recent film that's worth a look called Cézanne et moi, Cézanne and me, that came out in France, and it depicts the relationship between these two men. You can see that the film covers that aspect of their relationship as well. So this is a painting of the Salon des Refusés in 1863. There's the building where it was housed. Now, essentially, the dynamic was that each year the painters of the Academy would hang their paintings, and then these more innovative artists would submit their paintings to be included in these exhibits, and they would constantly be refused. And the public, and then Zola would write, he wrote journalistic articles about this, and the clamor became so great that Napoleon III, who was the sovereign of France at that time, said, okay, well, this is not the Napoleon, it's his nephew, who said, let's hold a salon, and we'll display all of these paintings that were not accepted by the Academy, and we'll let the public decide. And so they did this, and this is where the Monet painting that was so controversial was displayed and caused the public to come and laugh at it. But they laughed at many of the other paintings of the Impressionists as well. It caused quite a scandal. In fact, the general feeling at the time was that the display of those paintings shown at the Salon des Refusés proved the correctness of the Academy in refusing these paintings, because the general public simply didn't understand or appreciate much what they were looking at, and they came essentially to laugh at many of these paintings, which in their eyes were so outlandish, and they even thought were were kind of a hoax that these painters were visiting upon them. Now, this is the painting, the Petit Déjeuner sur l'herbe, that became so, of Manet, that became so controversial. And part of the controversy, we can see it. We can see the naturalism here displayed in the painting, much like the other paintings of Manet that I showed you. But the woman who is disrobed in the company of two men, this seemed just this, in terms of bourgeois moral scruples, this was just completely outrageous. Now, I might note as well that it was perfectly fine to display nudes in Orientalist painting, because that was the Far East, the exotic world of the other, with violence and sexuality. But in the case of women in the time who were just contemporaries of those who were alive at that time in France, this was just utterly scandalous. This is an enormous tableau as well, and so this shocked the sensibility. It became a source of great derision. So in the scenes in the novel where Zola describes the Lantier's painting, he's really modeling this part more after what happened when Manet showed this painting, which today many people regard as a very great painting indeed. Picasso, for instance, did many variations on this painting as well. It's been greatly influential, but at the time it was just the public thought it was just an outrage. And here's the description of, now Christine, again, is the character that was modeled after Cézanne's wife, Hortense. And she didn't like it either, the way that Zola describes it. And so here's her looking at this painting, because he uses her in the novel. Claude uses her as the model for this nude that appears in the painting. Christine, lifting her eyes, looked at the large picture, the canvas that had been turned to the wall on the previous occasion, which she had vainly wished to see. The background, the dark glade pierced by a flood of sunlight, was still only broadly brushed in. But the two little wrestlers, the fair one and the dark, almost finished by now, showed clearly in the light. In the foreground, the gentleman in the velveteen jacket, 3 times begun afresh, had now been left in distress. The painter was more particularly working at the principal figure, the woman lying on the grass. He had not touched the head again. He was battling with the body, changing his model every week, so despondent at being unable to satisfy himself that for a couple of days he had been trying to improve the figure from imagination without recourse to nature. Now note again, in the novel, Christine, who again is modeled after Cézanne's wife, Hortense, becomes the figure who inspires Claude Lantier to paint this in this painting, and he places her in the painting. And then when the public laughs at this painting, it's very traumatic to her. Although he boasted that he never invented Christine, at once recognized herself. Yes, that nude girl sprawling on the grass, one arm behind her head, smiling with lowered eyelids, was herself, for she had her features. The idea absolutely revolted her, and she was wounded too by the wildness of the painting, so brutal indeed that she considered herself abominably insulted. She did not understand that kind of art. She thought it execrable, and felt a hatred against it, the instinctive hatred of an enemy. She rose at last and curtly repeated, "I must be going." Claude watched her attentively, both grieved and surprised by her sudden change of manner. Now, this is going to become one of the major themes in the narrative, how Claude becomes obsessed with the women that he creates in his paintings, but in doing so neglects the living woman who is his model and his wife, and she becomes increasingly jealous, not of other models, not of other women, but of the women that he paints. And so this very interesting theme, she sees these images of herself that he paints as her double, as being a kind of a rival to her. And she's also she doesn't understand his painting. She's particularly at the beginning of their relationship, and she's like the general public. She's simply repulsed by what this man, whom she cares about very much, is doing as an artist. And she, perhaps like Zola, has reservations about his genius. Here's again a nude of Cezanne. He painted quite a few nudes, and the public also were astonished, for instance, at how he would use colors in his depictions of nudes that no one had ever done before. But he used his own wife as his model for many of his paintings. Now, on the 15th of May, a Friday, Claude, who had returned at 3 o'clock in the morning from Sandoz's, who's again the character based after Zola, was still asleep at 9 when Madame Joseph brought him up a large bouquet of white lilacs, which a commissaire had just left downstairs. He understood at once that his Christine, who at that point is not his wife but his mistress, had wished to be beforehand in celebrating the success of his painting. For this was a great day for him, the opening day of the Salon of the Rejected, the Salon des Refusés, which was first instituted that year and at which his picture, refused by the hanging committee of the Salon, was to be exhibited. So this is the great day. She finally consents to letting him paint her, and he paints her into the image, and he takes the painting. And it's said that when Cezanne brought his paintings to the Salon, he carried them in a wheelbarrow. So Zola has the same thing happen in the novel. Now Bongrand, who was one of the friends of Sandoz, tells them about the outrage of the committee members when they see these paintings. He says, "You can have no idea of the rage and indignation among the members of the hanging committee," he tells Sandoz. And he says, "Remember, I'm distrusted. They generally keep quiet when I'm there, but they are all furious with the realists," again, with these painters that Zola is going to call naturalists, but later become known as impressionists. "It was to them that they systematically closed the doors of the temple. It is on account of them that the emperor," it would be Napoleon III, "has allowed the public to revise their verdict. And finally, it is they, the realists, who triumph. Ah, I hear some nice things said. I wouldn't give a high price for your skins, youngsters." And so he's saying, you guys, you're walking into the lion's den, and you better have courage. So now Claude, he goes in to see what's happening as his painting's being exhibited. And so again, he's describing this character, but it's very similar to what happened when Monet saw his painting exhibited, who was again a close friend of Zola's. Claude had raised his head to listen. A tremendous uproar, an incessant crashing that had not struck him at first, careened through the air. It was like the din of a tempest beating against a cliff, the rumbling of an untiring assault, dashing forward from endless space. "Hello, what's that?" he muttered. "That," said Bongrand as he walked away, "that's the crowd upstairs in the galleries," perhaps more of a mob. And the two young fellows, having crossed the garden, then went up to the Salon of the Rejected. He affected, Claude, to be in no hurry, in spite of the almost irresistible desire that he felt to run. He raised his head and looked around him, and soon, amidst the loud voices of the crowd that had bewildered him, he distinguished some restrained laughter, which was almost drowned by the tramp of feet and the hubbub of conversation. Before certain pictures, the public stood joking. That made him feel uneasy, for despite all his revolutionary brutality, he was as sensitive and as credulous as a woman, and always looked forward to martyrdom, though he was ever grieved and stupefied at being repulsed and railed at. Claude, who brought up the rear, still heard the laughter that rose on the air, a swelling clamor, the roll of a tide near its full. And as he finally entered the room, he beheld a vast, swarming, closely packed crowd pressing eagerly in front of his picture. All the laughter arose, spread, and ended there. And it was his picture that was being laughed at. His friend wished to take him away, but he became obstinate and drew nearer instead. Now that he had judged his work, he listened and looked at the crowd. The explosion continued, culminated in an ascending scale of mad laughter. No sooner had visitors crossed the threshold than he saw their jaws part, their eyes grow small, their entire faces expand, and he heard the tempestuous puffing of the fat men, the rusty grating jeers of the lean ones, amidst all the shrill, flute-like laughter of the women. Now, of course, we know that nobody's laughing today. These are considered to be some of the greatest paintings ever painted. But at the time, the public just did not understand them, and they thought it was a complete farce. And this was one of the reasons why so many of the painters who painted at this time lived in such abject poverty. Opposite him, against the handrail, some young fellows went into contortions as if somebody had been tickling them. One lady had flung herself on a seat, stifling and trying to regain breath with her handkerchief over her mouth. Rumors of this picture, which was so very, very funny, must have been spreading, for there was a rush from the four corners of the salon. Bands of people arrived, jostling each other, and all eagerness to share the fun. Where is it? Over there. Oh, what a joke. And the witticisms fell thicker than elsewhere. It was especially the subject that caused merriment. People failed to understand it, thought it insane, comical enough to make one ill with laughter. You see, the lady feels too hot while the gentleman has put on his velveteen jacket for fear of catching cold. Again, alluding to the way in which the woman is disrobed, but the man is fully dressed. Not at all. She is already blue. The gentleman has pulled her out of the pond, and he is resting at a distance, holding his nose. I tell you, it's a young ladies' school out for a ramble. Look at the two playing at leapfrog. Hello, washing day. The flesh is blue. The trees are blue. He's dipped his picture in the bluing tub. All right, so the blue. So Cezanne did paint, nudes in blue, and this astounded people, like a body, flesh being painted blue. It was outrageous in the eyes of some. But this is again, Zola really is describing here what happened with the Monet painting, and so it's important to note that the figure Claude, it is a composite. But Cezanne understood very well who Zola was writing about. There were too many detailed personal recollections, and so it's when you read the novel, you'll see what I'm talking about. It's quite understandable why he would take such offense at the novel. But at the time he says, well, and what of it if the public does laugh, cried Claude. We must educate the public, that's all. In reality, it's a victory. Take away 200 grotesque canvases and our salon beats theirs. We have courage and audacity. We are the future. Yes, you'll see it later on. And we shall kill their salon. We shall enter it as conquerors by dint of producing masterpieces. Laugh, laugh, you big stupid Paris. Laugh until you fall on your knees before us. And this proves prophetic, but it's very interesting to reflect that when Zola writes this, he doesn't really believe it himself, but this in fact has been what this is the case, and these painters have totally triumphed, even if Zola himself lost faith in them. Now, when Christine goes, she's crushed. And this novel is also kind of a love story between Christine and Claude. It's a tragic, very sad love story, but she's very, she's a very kind of a provincial, conventional in terms of her morality. She doesn't even really want to take off her clothes to model for him. And so all of this is very disconcerting to her, and she feels they're laughing at her when they laugh at the portrait because the portrait is so obviously of her. Christine told him of her mad desire to see the picture. So she goes to the salon itself. It's her prank of going to the salon and how she had tumbled into it amidst the storm of laughter, amidst the jeers of all those people. It was she whom they had hissed like that. It was on herself that they had spat, and seized with wild terror, distracted with grief and shame, she had fled, as if she could feel that laughter lashing her like a whip until the blood flowed. But she now forgot about herself and the concern for him, upset by the thought of the grief he must feel. For her womanly sensibility magnified the bitterness of the repulse, and she was eager to console. So here's a painting by Cézanne. We'll end this lecture on this note. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to look a little bit more deeply at the relationship between Claude and Christine, and how this painting becomes. How Claude's painting becomes a kind of a rival for her, and then Claude's descent into poverty, which the novel ends on this very tragic moment of Claude hanging himself before his failed masterpiece, and this also might give us some indication why Cézanne would have found this to be such an offensive novel. And similarly, although he did, of course, understood that it was a novel and the character of Claude was not just him, but it would be very hard, I think, for anyone to accept such a portrait of oneself, particularly in the way in which Sandoz becomes seen as this figure of success, whereas Claude is this figure of failure. But we'll look to, in the next lecture, at some of the responses of the contemporaries like Van Gogh, Monet, Renoir to this novel. And it was universally, the painters did not like this novel at all. And we'll see what they have to say about it.